Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled slightly as she stood before the full-length mirror in the luxurious bridal suite of St. Mary's Church. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, making the crystals on her wedding dress sparkle like morning dew. At 28 years old, she was about to become Mrs. Richard Thompson, a thought that brought both excitement and an unexplainable heaviness to her heart. "Hold still, Sarah." Jessica, her maid of honor, fussed with the delicate veil, trying to position it perfectly among Sarah's soft brown curls. The other bridesmaids bustled around the room in their pale blue dresses, checking their makeup and adjusting their flowers. Sarah took a deep breath, studying her reflection. The dress was everything she had dreamed of since she was a little girl, a classic A-line silhouette with delicate lace sleeves and tiny pearls stunned into the bodice. Her mother had cried when she first tried it on at the boutique 6 months ago, declaring it was meant to be. "You look absolutely beautiful," her mother, Linda, said from her seat in the corner, already dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Richard won't know what hit him when he sees you walking down that aisle." Richard. Sarah's lips curved into a small smile as she thought of her soon-to-be husband. He was everything a woman could want. Successful, kind, stable, and deeply in love with her. They had met 3 years ago at a friend's dinner party, where he had charmed her with his quiet humor and gentle manner. Their relationship had progressed smoothly, like a well-planned business merger, which made sense given his career as a senior accountant at one of the city's top firms. 15 minutes until we need to line up," Jessica announced, checking her phone. The declaration sent a fresh wave of butterflies through Sarah's stomach. As her bridesmaids gathered their bouquets and made last-minute adjustments to their hair and makeup, Sarah's mind wandered to the moment Richard had proposed. It had been during their vacation in Hawaii, at sunset on the beach. He had planned everything perfectly: the private dinner, photographer hidden behind some palm trees, even making sure her manicure was fresh for the ring photos. That was Richard, always thinking ahead, always making sure everything was just right. "Sarah, honey?" Her mother's voice broke through her thoughts. "Are you feeling okay? You look a bit pale." "I'm fine, Mom," Sarah assured her, forcing a bright smile. "Just normal wedding day jitters, I guess." Linda stood up and walked over to her daughter, placing her hands on Sarah's shoulders as they both looked in the mirror. "You know, it's normal to feel nervous on your wedding day. I remember when I married your father, I was so anxious I nearly tripped walking down the aisle." The story made Sarah laugh, easing some of the tension in her shoulders. Her parents had been married for 35 years now, still as in love as ever. That's what she wanted with Richard, a love that would stand the test of time. A knock at the door made everyone jump. "Is everyone decent?" Sarah's father's voice called out. "Come in, Dad," Sarah answered, turning to face the door. George Mitchell stepped into the room, looking dapper in his black tuxedo. The moment he saw his daughter, his eyes welled up with tears. "Oh, Princess," he whispered, using her childhood nickname. "You look absolutely stunning." Sarah felt her own eyes growing misty as her father pulled her into a gentle hug, careful not to wrinkle her dress. "Thanks, Dad," she murmured against his shoulder. "The guests are all seated," he informed them, checking his watch. "And Richard is at the altar, looking about as nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs." Everyone laughed at the old-fashioned expression, and the bridesmaids began gathering their things. Sarah took one final look in the mirror, adjusting her veil and smoothing down her dress. Everything was perfect: the dress, the flowers, the venue, the groom. So why did she feel like something was missing? "It's time," Jessica announced, holding out Sarah's bouquet of white roses and lilies. Sarah took the flowers, their sweet scent filling her nose. This was it, the moment she had been planning for the past year. In less than an hour, she would be Mrs. Richard Thompson. As she lined up behind her bridesmaids, ready to make her way to the church's main entrance, she pushed away the small voice in her head that whispered of doubt. After all, this was exactly what she had always wanted. Wasn't it? The church's main hall buzzed with quiet conversation as guests found their seats. Sarah stood hidden behind the large wooden doors, her heart beating steadily as she watched through a small crack between them. The afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns across the white aisle runner where she would soon walk. "Everything looks perfect," Jessica whispered, peeking over Sarah's shoulder. The bridesmaids stood in formation behind them, their blue dresses rustling softly as they shifted their feet. Sarah's eyes moved systematically over the crowd, recognizing familiar faces. Richard's large family taking up most of the left side, her smaller family on the right, college friends, work colleagues, all dressed in their finest. Her gaze paused briefly on Richard's grandmother, who had flown in from Florida despite her fear of flying, just to be here for their special day. Then she saw him. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There, sitting quietly in the fourth row on her side of the church, was James Harrison, her first love, the boy who had kissed her under the bleachers at their high school graduation, the man who had held her hand through her father's heart surgery, the dreamer who had left 6 years ago to join Doctors Without Borders, leaving behind nothing but a heartfelt letter and years of what-ifs. "Sarah?" Jessica touched her arm, concern in her voice. "You look like you've seen a ghost." In many ways she had. James looked different now. His once wild dark hair was shorter, more controlled. His face was tanned, likely from years working in various countries, and fine lines had formed around his eyes. He wore a well-fitted gray suit that made him look more grown-up than the jeans and t-shirts she remembered him in. But his presence still affected her the same way it had in high school, like a jolt of electricity through her system. "I'm fine," Sarah managed to whisper, though her mouth had gone dry. "Just surprised to see someone I wasn't expecting." Her mind raced back to their last night together. They had been sitting in his old Volkswagen, parked at their favorite spot overlooking the city. James had just received his acceptance to the medical program that would lead him to Doctors Without Borders. Sarah had been accepted to law school locally. Their paths were diverging, and they both knew it. "Come with me," he had asked that night, his eyes bright with dreams and possibilities. "We could help people together, see the world, make a real difference." But Sarah had been practical, focused on her career goals, on building a stable life. She couldn't imagine leaving everything behind for an uncertain future, no matter how romantic it sounded. They had parted ways that night, both crying, both believing they were making the right choice. Now here he was, 6 years later, on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Why did he come? Sarah whispered to herself, forgetting Jessica was still beside her. "Who came?" Jessica asked, trying to follow Sarah's line of sight. Before Sarah could answer, the wedding coordinator appeared, clapping her hands softly to get everyone's attention. "All right, ladies, it's time to get into final position. The musicians are ready to start." Sarah's father appeared at her side, offering his arm. "Ready, princess?" She looked at him, trying to hide the turmoil in her heart. The church doors would open in minutes, and she would have to walk past James, past all those memories and what-ifs, to reach Richard, steady, reliable Richard who had never asked her to choose between him and her dreams. "Did you know," she whispered to her father, "that James would be here?" George Mitchell's face softened with understanding. "Richard invited him," he said gently, "said it was important to show there were no hard feelings, that the past was the past." Sarah closed her eyes briefly. That was such a Richard thing to do, logical, mature, completely unaware of the emotional tornado he had just invited into his wedding. She could hear the musicians beginning the processional music for the bridesmaids. "Sarah." Her father squeezed her arm gently. "Are you okay?" She opened her eyes, forcing a smile. "Of course, Dad, let's do this." But as the wedding coordinator began sending the bridesmaids down the aisle one by one, Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. In a few moments, those doors would open fully, and she would have to walk past the man who had once represented everything she thought she wanted, to marry the man who represented everything she thought she should want. The coordinator turned to her with a smile. "Ready, bride?" The wedding march began to play, filling the church with its familiar, majestic notes. Sarah took one final deep breath as the heavy wooden doors swung open fully, revealing her to the waiting congregation. Everyone rose to their feet, turning to watch her entrance. She felt her father's arm tighten reassuringly around hers as they took their first step forward. Sarah had imagined this moment countless times during the past year of planning. The music, the flowers, the faces of loved ones smiling at her. But nothing had prepared her for the reality of walking down this aisle with James Harrison watching from just a few feet away. She kept her eyes forward at first, focusing on Richard waiting at the altar. He looked handsome in his black tuxedo, his face beaming with joy and love as he watched her approach. This was how it should be, the bride looking lovingly at her groom as she walked toward their future together. But halfway down the aisle, Sarah's resolve crumbled. Almost against her will, her eyes shifted to the fourth row, meeting James's gaze. Time seemed to slow down as their eyes locked. Familiar crinkles appeared around his eyes as he gave her a sad, gentle smile, the same smile he'd given her the night he left. Her steps faltered slightly, and her father's grip on her arm tightened. "Steady now, princess," he whispered, so quietly only she could hear. The brief exchange with James lasted only seconds, but it sent Sarah's mind spinning back through memories. She remembered their first date at the local diner, where James had made her laugh so hard that milkshake came out of her nose. She thought of the time they had gotten caught in a sudden rainstorm and ended up dancing in the downpour, not caring that they were soaked to the bone. She recalled the way he used to look at her, like she was the most fascinating person in the world, even when she was just talking about her day. The memories contrasted sharply with her relationship with Richard. Their dates had been at proper restaurants, with reservations made well in advance. They had never been caught in the rain, because Richard always checked the weather forecast and carried an umbrella. He listened to her attentively, but with the measured interest of someone who cared about her well-being rather than someone captivated by her every word. Each step down the aisle felt heavier than the last. Sarah could feel droplets of sweat forming on her palms, making the bouquet slip slightly in her grip. The church suddenly felt too warm, too crowded, too real. "You're doing great," her father whispered again, patting her hand. She wondered if he could sense her internal struggle, if he remembered the days after James left when she had cried herself to sleep in her childhood bedroom. They were nearly at the altar now. Richard's smile had grown even wider, if that was possible. He looked so happy, so certain. Sarah tried to mirror his expression, to focus on the life they had planned together. The house in the suburbs they had already picked out, the 2 children they had agreed would be perfect, the comfortable routine they would settle into. But her eyes betrayed her again, darting back to James one final time as she passed his row. He was still watching her, but his expression had changed. There was something in his eyes now. Regret? Longing? Or was she just seeing what she wanted to see? Sarah's father stopped at the altar steps, turning to face her. This was the moment, the traditional giving away of the bride. She felt his hands trembling slightly as he lifted her veil, kissed her cheek, and placed her hand in Richard's waiting palm. "Take care of my little girl," George Mitchell said to Richard, his voice thick with emotion. "I will, sir. I promise," Richard replied earnestly, squeezing Sarah's hand. As her father stepped back, Sarah took her place beside Richard at the altar. His hand was warm and steady around hers, just like always, just like it would be for the rest of their lives together. The priest opened his book and began to speak, his voice echoing through the church. But Sarah couldn't focus on the words. Her heart was pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. She was acutely aware of James sitting just a few rows behind her, of Richard's hand holding hers, of her father watching proudly from the front row, of hundreds of eyes fixed upon her. The priest's voice continued, moving steadily toward the moment of truth, while Sarah stood frozen in time, caught between the safety of her future and the passion of her past. As the priest continued with the ceremony, Sarah's mind drifted away from the altar, back to her last night with James. It had been a warm summer evening 6 years ago when everything changed. The memory was so vivid it made her current reality fade into the background, despite Richard standing beside her, despite the hundreds of guests watching. That night, she and James had parked at Henderson's Point, their favorite overlook spot. The city lights had twinkled below them like earthbound stars. James had brought pizza from their favorite place, half pepperoni for him, half mushroom for her. They had sat on the hood of his old car, talking about their future while the metal slowly cooled beneath them. "This isn't goodbye forever," James had said, his voice cracking slightly. "I'll write to you. We can video call when there's internet. Maybe after my first year, you could come visit." Sarah remembered how young they had been, how full of dreams and possibilities. She had just gotten into law school, and he had been accepted into the medical program that would lead him to Doctors Without Borders. Their paths had stretched out before them like diverging roads on a map. "Sarah," Richard's gentle voice pulled her back to the present. He was looking at her with concern, still holding her hand. She realized she had missed something the priest had said. "Sorry," she whispered, trying to focus on the ceremony, but her mind was determined to replay that last night with James. They had talked until the moon was high in the sky, making promises they both knew would be hard to keep. James had told her about the places he wanted to see, the people he wanted to help. His eyes had sparkled with passion as he described his dreams of building clinics in remote villages, of making a real difference in the world. The ceremony book, dear, the priest whispered, gesturing to the leather-bound volume that Richard now held. Sarah blinked, realizing she needed to hold one side while Richard held the other. The guests probably thought she was just nervous, but Richard's slight frown suggested he sensed something more. The memory continued to play in her mind as the priest read from the book. She remembered how James had turned to her in the moonlight, his face serious. "Come with me," he had said. "We could do this together. You could help with the legal side of things, setting up programs, advocating for resources. We could make a difference together." For a moment, one brief, terrifying moment, she had considered it. The idea of throwing caution to the wind, of following her heart instead of her head, had been intoxicating. But then reality had set in. She thought about her parents, her career plans, the stable life she had always imagined for herself. "I can't," she had whispered, watching his face fall. "I have responsibilities here, plans. I can't just leave everything." Richard was now reciting his vows, his voice clear and confident. He spoke about love, commitment, and building a life together. His words were perfect, carefully chosen and heartfelt. Yet Sarah found herself remembering James' last words to her that night. "Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking one at all," he had said, kissing her one last time before driving away. She had stood there watching his taillights disappear, telling herself she had made the right choice. Law school had followed, then her career, and then Richard, wonderful, stable, predictable Richard who had never asked her to choose between him and her dreams because his dreams aligned so perfectly with hers. Or at least, with what she thought her dreams should be. "Sarah," the priest's voice cut through her memories. "Are you ready to recite your vows?" She looked at Richard, who was watching her with such trust and love. He had been nothing but good to her for the past 3 years. He had supported her career, introduced her to his family, planned a future that looked exactly like the one she had always said she wanted. But standing there, with James's presence burning like a flame behind her, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if what she had always said she wanted was really what her heart desired. The vows she had memorized stuck in her throat as she opened her mouth to speak. Richard squeezed her hand encouragingly, misinterpreting her hesitation as simple nerves. The priest waited patiently, while the congregation sat in respectful silence. The weight of the moment pressed down on her like a physical force, making it hard to breathe in her perfectly fitted wedding dress. The choice she had made 6 years ago suddenly didn't feel so final anymore. The priest cleared his throat and spoke the words that every wedding guest anticipates. "If anyone objects to this union, speak now or forever hold your peace." The silence in the church was deafening. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the slight tremor in her hands as she held her bouquet. She didn't dare turn around, but she knew exactly where James was sitting. 4 rows back, slightly to the left. His presence felt like a physical force pressing against her back. Richard stood confidently beside her, seemingly untroubled by this traditional moment of potential disruption. Of course he wasn't worried. He had been the one to invite James, after all. In his logical mind, inviting her ex-boyfriend showed maturity and security in their relationship. He had no idea about the storm of emotions raging through Sarah's heart. The seconds ticked by. Sarah found herself holding her breath, half terrified, half hoping that James would stand up and say something, anything. But he remained silent, respecting her choice just as he had 6 years ago when she chose her career path over following him. Through the corner of her eye, Sarah caught her mother dabbing at tears with a tissue. Linda Mitchell had always loved Richard, had been thrilled when he proposed. "He's such a sensible choice," she had said while helping Sarah plan the wedding. The word sensible echoed in Sarah's mind now, taking on a different meaning than before. Sarah's hands began to tremble more noticeably. Jessica, ever the attentive maid of honor, stepped forward slightly, probably thinking she needed to adjust the bride's dress or bouquet. But Sarah wasn't focusing on her dress anymore. Her mind was racing through all the decisions that had led her to this moment. She thought about the day Richard proposed. It had been perfect. A sunset beach in Hawaii, a photographer hidden nearby to capture the moment, the ring exactly what she would have chosen for herself. He had even called her parents beforehand to get their blessing. Everything had been planned to perfection, just like Richard planned everything in his life. Then she thought about the day James told her he was leaving. It hadn't been planned at all. They had been eating takeout in his apartment when he got the email confirming his acceptance. He had jumped up from the couch, spilling sweet and sour sauce on his shirt. His face lit up with excitement and possibility. The memory was so vivid she could almost smell the Chinese food. The silence in the church stretched on. The priest shifted slightly, preparing to move forward with the ceremony. Sarah felt a drop of sweat roll down her back beneath her wedding dress. The air conditioning hummed softly, but she felt overheated, almost dizzy. She glanced at Richard, who gave her an encouraging smile. He probably thought she was just nervous about speaking her vows in front of so many people. His hand reached for hers, steady and warm, just like always. But for the first time, that steadiness felt more like an anchor than a comfort. Behind her, someone coughed quietly. Was it James? She resisted the urge to turn and look. Her bouquet trembled visibly now, the white roses shaking like leaves in a storm. A few guests shifted in their seats, perhaps picking up on her distress. Sarah's father leaned forward slightly in his front row seat, concern evident on his face. He had always supported her decisions, even when she chose to stay behind instead of following James. But now she could see something in his expression. Was it recognition? Understanding? Did he see the doubt in her eyes? The priest finally broke the weighted silence. Very well, then, let us proceed with the vows. Still no objection from James. Of course not. He was too honorable to disrupt her wedding, too respectful of her choices to cause a scene. The James she knew would never do something so dramatic, even if his heart was breaking just like hers. Richard turned to face her fully now, ready to exchange their vows. His face showed nothing but love and certainty. He had no doubts about their future together. Sarah tried to mirror his expression, but her lips wouldn't cooperate. They trembled traitorously, and her vision blurred with unshed tears. The weight of the moment pressed down on her like a physical force. Every eye in the church was on her, waiting for her to speak the words that would bind her to Richard forever. But as she opened her mouth, she realized that sometimes the loudest objection comes not from someone else, but from your own heart. Sarah Mitchell, do you take Richard Thompson to be your lawfully wedded husband? The priest's words seemed to echo through the church, each syllable hanging heavily in the air. Sarah stood frozen, staring into Richard's eyes. His warm brown gaze held nothing but love and trust, the same steady, dependable love she had counted on for the past 3 years. In that moment, she saw their entire relationship flash before her. Their first meeting at the dinner party, where he had charmed her with clever jokes about tax season. The first date at the French restaurant where he'd impressed her with his knowledge of fine wines. The Sunday brunches with his family. The carefully planned vacation where he proposed. Richard was everything she had told herself she wanted. He was successful, kind, and clearly devoted to her. He had never asked her to change, never challenged her career choices, never pushed her out of her comfort zone. Looking at him now, she could see their future laid out like a perfectly drawn blueprint. The house in the suburbs, the 2.5 kids, the golden retriever, the family vacations to Disney World. Sarah, the priest prompted gently when she didn't immediately respond. She opened her mouth to say, "I do," the words she had rehearsed so many times. But they wouldn't come. Instead, tears began streaming down her face, mascara probably creating dark rivers on her cheeks. Richard's expression shifted from joy to concern. "Sweetheart," he whispered, reaching out to touch her arm. "Are you okay?" Sarah looked into his kind eyes and saw the man who had loved her unconditionally. The man who had supported her through difficult cases at work, who remembered how she liked her coffee, who had learned to cook her favorite meals. The man who deserved someone who loved him completely, without reservation or regret. The church was silent except for the soft rustle of clothing as guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah could feel hundreds of eyes on her, could sense the growing tension in the air. Her mother made a small, distressed sound from the front row. She turned to face the congregation, tears flowing freely now. Her eyes automatically found James in the 4th row. He sat perfectly still, his face a mask of carefully controlled emotion. But she could see the hope he was trying to hide, the same hope that had been in his eyes that night 6 years ago when he'd asked her to come with him. Then she looked at Richard again, this wonderful man who deserved more than a bride whose heart was divided. The words came out in a whisper, but in the silent church, everyone heard them clearly. "I'm sorry, but I can't do this." A collective gasp rose from the guests. Richard's face drained of color, but even in his shock and pain, his first instinct was to reach for her, to try to help. That simple gesture of kindness only made Sarah cry harder. "You're the most wonderful man I've ever known," she said, her voice breaking. "But I can't marry you knowing that I'm not being completely honest, with you or with myself." Jessica stepped forward, perhaps to stop her, but Sarah shook her head. The truth was pouring out of her now, unstoppable as a summer storm. "You deserve someone who loves you with their whole heart," she continued, looking at Richard through her tears. "Someone who wants the same things you want, not because they think they should want them, but because they truly do. And she paused, taking a shaky breath. "I don't know what I want anymore, but I know it's not fair to marry you while I'm still trying to figure that out." Richard stood very still, his face a mixture of hurt and understanding. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle, even through his obvious pain. "You never really stopped loving him, did you?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah looked down at her bouquet, at the perfect white roses she had chosen to match her perfect white dress. Everything about this wedding had been perfect, except for the bride's heart. "I'm so sorry," she whispered again, slipping the engagement ring off her finger and placing it in his palm. His hand closed around it automatically, and she saw a tear fall onto his perfectly pressed tuxedo sleeve. The church had erupted into shocked whispers. Sarah could hear her mother crying, could sense the chaos that was about to unfold. But for the first time since she walked into the church, she could breathe freely. She just didn't know what she was going to do next. The church erupted into chaos as Sarah turned away from the altar. Several people stood up, voices rising in confusion and concern. Her mother let out a sob, while her father sat in stunned silence. Richard's family began speaking in loud, angry whispers. Sarah's mind was spinning, but her feet seemed to know what to do. She gathered her dress in her hands and began walking back down the aisle, not in the measured, graceful steps of a bride, but in quick, desperate strides. The same path she had walked just minutes before now felt entirely different. Many people expected her to stop at James's row. Even James himself half rose from his seat, his face a mixture of hope and uncertainty. But Sarah kept walking. She moved past him without a glance, though she could feel his eyes following her. She couldn't stop, not for Richard, not for James, not for anyone. "Sarah, wait." Jessica called out behind her, the sound of heels clicking on marble indicating she was following. But Sarah had already reached the heavy wooden doors. She pushed them open with both hands, the bright sunlight momentarily blinding her as she emerged into the afternoon air. Outside the church, Sarah didn't slow down. She ran down the stone steps, her white dress billowing behind her like a cloud. The wedding photographer, who had been setting up for post-ceremony shots, raised his camera instinctively, then lowered it, seemingly unsure if he should document this moment. Sarah could hear more voices behind her now, her mother calling her name, Jessica's concerned shouts, even Richard's deep voice asking everyone to give her space, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Her feet carried her past the perfectly decorated wedding cars, past the scattered rose petals that marked the path where she and Richard should have walked as newlyweds. She ran until she reached the small garden at the side of the church, hidden from view by a row of carefully trimmed hedges. There, finally alone, she collapsed onto a stone bench, her breath coming in great gasps. Her perfectly styled hair was coming loose, tendrils falling around her face. The expensive makeup she'd had professionally applied was surely ruined by tears and sweat. For the first time since she'd said, "I can't," the full weight of what she'd done hit her. She had just left Richard at the altar. Sweet, kind, dependable Richard who had never been anything but good to her. She had embarrassed both their families, wasted thousands of dollars in wedding expenses, and probably ruined countless relationships in the process. Yet beneath the guilt and shame, Sarah felt something else: relief. It spread through her chest like warmth from a summer sun, making it easier to breathe despite her tears. She hadn't realized how much pressure she'd been carrying until it was gone. The sound of footsteps on gravel made her look up, expecting to see Jessica or her parents. Instead, she saw the church's elderly gardener, Mr. Peterson, who she'd met during the wedding preparations. He was watching her with kind eyes as he watered the flowers. Sometimes, he said gently, not stopping his work, the bravest thing we can do is admit when we're on the wrong path, even if we've walked it for a long time. Sarah looked at him through her tears, surprised by the simple wisdom in his words. He didn't seem shocked or judgmental about finding a runaway bride in his garden. He just continued tending to his flowers, giving her the space to breathe. More voices could be heard now, getting closer. Sarah stood up, gathering her dress again. She couldn't face them yet, not her parents, not Richard, not James. She needed time to think, to understand her own heart. "There's a side gate through those trees," Mr. Peterson said, not looking up from his flowers. "It leads to Cedar Street. My truck's parked there with the keys in the ignition. Return it whenever you're ready." Sarah stared at him in surprise, but he just nodded toward the trees. Without another word, she hurried through them, finding the small gate exactly where he'd said. Beyond it sat an old blue pickup truck. As she climbed into the truck, her elaborate wedding dress barely fitting in the cab, Sarah caught a glimpse of herself in the rearview mirror. Her makeup was streaked, her hair was a mess, and her expensive veil was hanging crooked. But her eyes were clear and bright for the first time in months. She started the engine just as voices approached the garden. As she pulled away from the church, she had no idea where she was going. But for the first time in years, she felt truly free. 3 months had passed since Sarah Mitchell became known as the runaway bride in her small town. Now, she sat at a small cafe in Chiang Mai, Thailand, watching children play in the schoolyard across the street. Her laptop was open on the wooden table, a half-finished lesson plan visible on the screen. The transformation from corporate lawyer to English teacher had surprised everyone, including herself. After leaving the church that day in Mr. Peterson's truck, she had driven straight to the airport, bought a one-way ticket to Thailand, and never looked back. The only thing she'd stopped for was a change of clothes, leaving her wedding dress carefully packed in a box on Mr. Peterson's front porch with a thank you note. Sarah took a sip of her iced coffee, smiling as one of her students waved at her through the cafe window. Teaching wasn't what she had planned for her life, but she found unexpected joy in helping these children learn English. Their enthusiasm and genuine happiness made her previous life of corporate law feel like a distant dream. Her phone buzzed with a new email notification. It was from Richard, a regular occurrence now that they had managed to rebuild a friendship from the ashes of their failed wedding. His message was simple. He had accepted a promotion in Seattle and was moving next month. Attached was a photo of him looking happy, standing next to a Sevoldi sign in front of a modern apartment building. Sarah felt genuine happiness for him. Their first conversation after the wedding had been difficult, tears, hurt feelings, and painful truths. But Richard, true to his nature, had shown remarkable understanding once the initial shock wore off. "I think I always knew your heart wasn't fully in it," he had written in his first email 2 months after the wedding day. "I just didn't want to admit it." As she typed a congratulatory reply to Richard, another message popped up, this one from James. Her heart did a small flip, but not the same desperate tumble it used to do. They had met for coffee once after the wedding, before she left for Thailand. The conversation had been both wonderful and uncomfortable, filled with shared memories and uncomfortable truths. "I thought leaving the wedding meant I would run straight to you," she had told him that day, "but I realized I needed to run toward myself first." James had understood. He was different too. Still passionate about his work with Doctors Without Borders, but also more grounded, more at peace with the choices they had both made. They had parted that day with a hug and a promise to stay in touch, which they had managed to do through occasional messages and updates. His current message asked about her teaching and shared news about his latest medical mission in Sudan. They had fallen into a comfortable rhythm of friendship, their past love transformed into something different but equally valuable. Sarah's phone buzzed again, this time with a text from her mother. The relationship with her parents had been strained after the wedding, but time and honest conversations had helped heal those wounds too. They had even come to visit her in Thailand last month, and her mother had surprised her by saying, "You seem happier here than you ever did at the law firm." Looking around the cafe, at the bustling street life of Chiang Mai, at her laptop filled with lesson plans instead of legal briefs, Sarah realized her mother was right. The path she had chosen, or rather, the path she had found by choosing not to follow the ones laid out for her, had led her to a life she never would have imagined. She opened her journal, a habit she had picked up since moving to Thailand. On its pages, she had documented her journey of self-discovery, her fears, her hopes, and gradually, her growing confidence in her choices. Today's entry would be different. Today, she felt ready to write about love. Not the desperate, clinging love she had felt for James in her youth, or the safe, comfortable love she had tried to feel for Richard. Instead, she wrote about learning to love herself enough to choose uncertainty over security, authenticity over expectations, and the unknown over the carefully planned. As the afternoon sun painted the cafe in warm golden light, Sarah closed her journal and smiled. She was still single, still figuring things out, still learning who she was without the labels of lawyer, almost wife, or even runaway bride. But for the first time in her life, she was completely, unequivocally herself. And that, she had learned, was the greatest love story of all.